Cannibal. There are a lot of ways to heal in the Fallout games. Stim packs, food, water, sleeping in a bed, and then there's the option where you decide other Wastelanders are also a food group. This is Cannibal, and it's shown up consistently since Fallout 3 with the developers finding new ways to make it weirder each time. While sneaking, you can interact with a fallen enemy to restore some HP, gain a few rads, and lose a chunk of karma in the older games. The animation locks you in third person, freezes your weapon, and holds you in place while you do your thing, presumably so the developers could make sure you really sat with what you were doing. Later games expanded the menu to include ghouls, super mutants, and eventually even scorched and mole miners, but the most psychologically devastating version came with survival mode, where one meal gives you a status effect called dark craving, and after that, regular food stops satisfying your hunger entirely. Stim packs won't fix this, cooked brahmin won't fix this. The only thing your character now recognizes as a meal is other people. The companion reactions are basically a complete spectrum of human emotion. Piper says she's about to be sick, Preston Garvey calls it just wrong, Kate offers to help you kick the habit, and Strong the super mutant gently reminds you to save him some. And then there's the Japanese release, where the entire perk was censored, renamed to Mystic Power, redrawn with a clean Vault Boy, reframed as the character using magic on the deceased to restore health. Contract Killer. Somewhere in the capital wasteland, there's a guy who runs a perfectly legitimate business buying body parts off morally upright people. His name is Daniel Littlehorn, and his office sits in a scrapyard that is completely inaccessible to you until the moment you decide to opt into his business model. Once you take the Contract Killer perk, any character with good karma you take out will spawn an ear in their inventory. You collect the ear, walk it back to Littlehorn, and he hands you 10 caps and 10 points of negative karma in exchange. If your karma is already in the basement at minus 750 or lower, the price goes up to 15 caps per ear, because Littlehorn rewards loyalty. The whole system is built around moral arbitrage. The worse a person you become, the better the conversion rate gets on the morally upright people you've taken collection from. There's a useful side effect too. If your karma is still good when you sign up, the scripted Talon Company squads that normally come after good-aligned Wastelanders will stop spawning entirely. The game apparently considers you a freelance contractor working a similar beat and decides there's no point sending you competition. There's also a bug where knocking an essential NPC unconscious spawns an ear on them every single time, which means you can produce a literally infinite ear economy off a single character who refuses to stay down. You can also have this perk active at the same time as its good-aligned counterpart, which is its own special kind of strange. In that scenario, you're operating a two-sided marketplace where you've signed up to handle both sides of the moral spectrum depending on who happens to be standing in front of you that day. It's the closest the Fallout series has ever come to having an actual freelance gig economy, and the gig is wandering the wasteland with a satchel full of biological receipts. Mr. Sandman. There's something especially dark about naming a stealth kill perk after a lullaby, but Fallout 3 looked at the song, paired it with the act of taking out someone in their sleep, and decided, yeah, that fits. Mr. Sandman lets you sneak up to anyone who's currently asleep and silently handle them, with a bonus 50 XP added on top. The animation is a short little sequence where your character looks around carefully, makes sure no one's watching, and then does the deed, accompanied by a cheerful cartoony jingle that the developers chose to include for some reason. The whole thing is locked behind sneak mode, but it shows up as an option when you go to pickpocket a sleeping target. You get a menu that lets you choose between pickpocket or merc, which is one of the more straightforward menus in any RPG. There's no karma penalty for using it either. The game considers being seen ending someone's life to be a moral failing, but doing the same thing in complete privacy is apparently fine. Now, there's a famous exploit where you can use this perk on sleeping children who are flagged as essential and therefore cannot actually be removed from existence. And so you get the XP, the animation plays out, and the kid just wakes up completely unharmed. You can then do it again immediately for another free 50 XP and again until you've leveled up entirely, thanks to a single child who just won't take the hint. There are also bugs where the target wakes up mid-animation, walks around the room, and then suddenly drops once the animation finishes, even though you're no longer actively performing the act it was depicting. You also don't need to actually own a weapon for any of this to work. The animation shows you using a combat knife either way. Ghastly Scavenger. If you took the Cannibal perk and finished a couple playthroughs thinking the menu felt a little limited, there's a follow-up made just for you. Ghastly Scavenger lets you do the same routine but on super mutants and feral ghouls, which restores significantly more HP, gives you a bigger dose of radiation, and still costs you karma. In hardcore mode, one snack also wipes out 50 points of starvation, which is genuinely a useful number if you're far from civilization and committed to the bit. The perk has one notable quirk. It's the only one in the entire Fallout series that requires you to have taken another specific perk before you can even pick it up. You have to have the first perk active basically, which is pretty unhinged, now that the practical use case for this thing in the Mojave is limited. There aren't a ton of feral ghouls wandering around the wasteland, and the super mutants are mostly concentrated at Black Mountain and Jacobstown, where most of them are either non-hostile or surrounded by allies you'd be turning against you in the process. So most of the perk's value is roleplay. You took it because you wanted to commit to a character who would consume literally any sentient being they came across, and the game wanted to reward you for thinking that far ahead. Joshua Sawyer was the one who came up with it, and on the same Formspring post where he admitted to designing this, he also took credit for Dine and Dash, because he thought the other perk options went really well with hardcore mode survivalism, which is the kind of design philosophy you don't see from a lot of mainstream studios. The perk also doesn't interact with Dine and Dash, by the way. You can't pocket a super mutant for the road. It's strictly a sit-down dining experience. Bloody Mess. Most Fallout perks try to improve your character in subtle, measurable ways. More damage with a specific weapon class, more skill points, better dialogue options. Bloody Mess just gives you 5% more damage on everything, and then makes enemies occasionally come apart in spectacular fashion. It's the only perk in the series that universally increases damage, which is actually kind of impressive in a balanced design sense. Every other damage boost in the game is tied to a specific weapon type, a specific situation, or a specific enemy. This one just says you hit harder, and then that's pretty much it. Ranks 2 and 3 raise the damage bonus to 10% and 15%, which is meaningful enough that this perk usually shows up on damage-focused builds across the entire fanbase. But the real selling point is rank 4. Once you take it, enemies that come apart have a chance to set off other nearby enemies, who then set off the ones near them, until you've created a chain reaction across an entire raider camp. The Fallout 4 Vault Dwellers survival guide literally calls these spectacular gore balls and says they're a real treat to watch explode, which is the kind of language you don't normally see in official Bethesda documentation. There's also a small bug at the highest rank where, if you trigger the chain effect, and there's nothing nearby for it to spread to, the game will sometimes target your own character with it. It doesn't actually deal damage, but it does make your character cry out in pain as if they just got shot, which is the engine apologizing to you for having no one else to apply the effect to. The in-game description of the perk is just, watch out for flying eyeballs, which is Bethesda being the most transparent they've ever been about what their games are actually about. Dine and Dash. The perk Cannibal had a problem. You had to commit to the whole thing on the spot, in real time, while everyone around you watched. If a raider went down in the middle of a crowded settlement, you couldn't exactly bring the situation somewhere private and handle it at your own pace. So Joshua Sawyer designed a challenge perk that fixes this exact issue. After you've used the C perk on 25 humanoid enemies, you unlock Dine and Dash, which lets you sneak up to someone you've recently defeated and take a portion to go. The remains show up in your inventory as a consumable item, which you can put away at your leisure, somewhere private like a well-adjusted person. And here's the genius part, Bitweb. Taking the remains off a defeated enemy isn't considered a crime against nature. You can do it in full view of NPCs, and they will not turn on you, presumably because their game logic doesn't understand what just happened. Eating the remains later, however, is still very much a crime against nature, and that part still has consequences. The name itself is a play on the slang term for skipping out on a restaurant bill, which is one of those word choices that's clever right up until you really think about what it's actually describing. One small detail, even though it's called human remains, you can pull them from ghoul bodies too, which is just a labeling oversight that nobody at Obsidian ever bothered to clean up. Ghoulish. Eventually, every Wastelander has to make peace with the glow. Ghoulish takes that idea to its extreme conclusion and says, actually, you should be running toward it. The perk turns rad poisoning into a healing source. You can wander into the glowing sea wearing nothing but your skivvies, which the Vault Dwellers survival guide actually recommends as a feature. At rank 3, the perk gets weirder. Feral ghouls in the area have a random chance to just go non-hostile around you. They don't recognize you as a friend exactly, they just stop registering you as a threat, presumably because at this point you smell similar enough to them that their brains can't classify you correctly. Rank 4, which comes with the Nuka World add-on, makes your radiation level slowly tick down on its own, meaning you don't even need Radaway anymore. You just need to be alive and not in a loading screen. There's a hilarious unintended consequence to all this, which is that Ghoulish has negative synergy with Rad Resistant, because Ghoulish heals you based on how much radiation you absorb. Becoming more resistant to radiation means you absorb less of it, which means less healing. So two perks designed to help you survive the wasteland will actively cancel each other out the more you invest in both. Also, uncooked food in this game is irradiated, which means once you take Ghoulish, every piece of raw mole rat meat you find functionally becomes a stim pack. Your character is essentially becoming a ghoul without going through the part where their skin falls off, which is technically a much better outcome than what happened to the actual ghouls. Meat of Champions. This is the perk that turns the entire main quest of New Vegas into a tasting menu. Most perks require you to hit a certain level or have a certain special stat. Meat of Champions requires you to have the C perk first, and then commit 4 separate counts of unaliving a monarch. The targets are the 4 most powerful figures in the Mojave, Caesar leading the Legion, Mr. House running New Vegas from his box of life support, the King ruling his own loyal faction in Freeside, and President Kimball serving as the elected leader of the NCR. You have to defeat each of them and have a snack, which is logistically a nightmare because every defeat represents a major faction turning permanently against you. Once you've done it, the reward is a 60-second buff that gives you +1 to strength, intelligence, charisma, and luck the next time you eat any human afterward. The buff is honestly not great. It lasts a minute, you've alienated 3 of the 4 major factions in the game, you're locked out of every major ending except the Yes Man path, and the only way to even trigger the boost is to find another human to munch on afterward, at which point you're probably already winning the encounter anyway. So most people who finish this perk are doing it for the achievement, the roleplay, or because they specifically wanted to feed Caesar to themselves and didn't see any reason not to. The idea came from Jason Bergman, who, according to Joshua Sawyer, was the one responsible for this particular design choice. He apparently looked at the hardcore mode survival theme and thought, what if you could literally absorb the personality traits of every major political figure in the wasteland by eating them? Nerd Rage. The perk that rewards you for almost dying. Nerd Rage triggers automatically once your HP drops below 20%, and the developers kept refining what it actually does across every game it's appeared in. The original version raises your strength stat to the maximum of 10 and adds a flat 50% damage resistance bonus on top of whatever you're already wearing. So you can be in the middle of getting absolutely demolished by a deathclaw, your health hits the threshold, and suddenly you're a swole nerd who can take 4 times as much punishment as before. Later versions changed the approach entirely. Instead of the strength buff, you now get a slow motion effect similar to using Jet, plus damage resistance and bonus outgoing damage that scales up as you take more ranks. At max rank, kills you make during the slow time effect restore some of your lost health on top of everything else, which means you're rewarded for going on a streak at exactly the moment you're about to flatline. The 76 version took it in yet another direction, because slowing down time doesn't really work when other players are involved. There, the perk scales linearly. The lower your health drops, the bigger the damage and action point regeneration bonuses get, which is just a constant gentle bribe to play the game on the verge of death at all times. The art for the perk has also stayed almost identical across every appearance. It's literally just the adrenaline rush art from Fallout 2 with a few minor changes. The same furious Vault Boy with his sleeves rolled up, ready to throw hands with whatever just shot him, which is genuinely the most Fallout thing about this perk. The original concept came out almost 30 years ago, and they've basically just been finding new ways to reuse it ever since. Intimidation. Sometimes the best way to deal with a raider is to skip the combat entirely and just ask nicely with a shotgun. Intimidation works by letting you aim any ranged weapon at a human enemy and press a button, at which point there's a 40% chance the target will raise their hands, surrender, and turn temporarily friendly to you. This works on raiders, gunners, Brotherhood soldiers, Children of Atom, Railroad agents, Minutemen, trappers, every single faction in the Nuka World DLC, and even Gen 3 synths. Which is interesting because synths technically aren't human, but the game's faction tagging apparently does not care about that nuance. Once an enemy is pacified, higher ranks of the perk let you incite them to attack their former allies, which is mechanically equivalent to making a Brotherhood soldier just go feral on his own squad because you said the right magic word. At the highest rank, you can give them direct commands, basically temporarily recruiting them as a follower, who will then turn back hostile on you the moment you holster your weapon or use a terminal. The faction-specific dialogue lines are kind of a chef's kiss. When you pacify a Brotherhood soldier, your character says, "Just relax, tech head," and when you incite them, you yell, "Ad Victoriam, kill," which is using their own faction battlecry against them. For the Children of Atom, the pacify line is, "Hands up, nut job," which is exactly the level of respect you'd expect from a Wastelander to a Radiation cult. This perk was created by Justin Schramm at Bethesda, who specifically built 3 perks designed for non-combat playstyles: Animal Friend, Wasteland Whisperer, and Intimidation. He apparently looked at the entire Fallout 4 combat system and thought, what if we let players just talk their way out of literally anything by pointing a gun at it? And then he made it happen. Terrifying Presence. Joshua Sawyer cooked on this one. Terrifying Presence is the one where, once you've got it, certain conversations unlock an extra dialogue option that lets you intimidate the person you're talking to so thoroughly that they flee the encounter for 5 whole seconds before combat actually begins. 5 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in a game where most fights are over in under a minute, having every enemy in the room running away while you take potshots at their backs is a meaningful tactical advantage. The list of situations where this perk actually shows up in dialogue is surprisingly long and surprisingly specific. You can use it on a Legion Explorer scout outside Nelson on Vulpes and Colta the first time you meet him in Nipton, on Caesar himself when you walk into his tent in the fort, and on Lieutenant Haggerty when she stops you at Helios 1. Some of the best applications are tucked into side quests. You can use it to evict Greasy Johnny from his squad, to threaten a low-level Legion private into snitching on himself, and to back the Gamora floor manager into giving up information he otherwise wouldn't share. There's also a moment in Dead Money where you can use it on Christine to make her walk into an elevator she really doesn't want to walk into, though picking this option permanently locks you out of a peaceful resolution to her storyline, so it's a real, are you sure you want this kind of choice. Sawyer made the whole perk himself, and later said on Formspring that he wished he'd given it more general combat applications. Grim Reaper's Sprint. This is the perk that runs on a renewable resource, and that resource is other people. The basic idea is simple. You take down someone in VATS, and the game refunds your action points so you can immediately go again. The more efficiently you process the hostiles around you, the more AP you have, which means more VATS attacks, which means more processed hostiles, which means more AP, and so on forever. It's a perpetual motion machine where the fuel is whoever happens to be standing nearby, and the output is more of the same. The exact numbers have shifted around over time. Sometimes the perk refunds your entire AP bar, sometimes a flat 20 points per VATS stat sequence, sometimes a percentage chance scaling off your luck stat, but the underlying philosophy has not budged in nearly 2 decades. At its most generous implementation, it can also refill your critical meter on top of the AP restore, because the developers apparently looked at the existing version and decided it wasn't quite rewarding aggression hard enough. There's a fun edge case where knocking an essential NPC unconscious counts as the perk's trigger condition, as far as the game logic is concerned, which means you can stand over any unremovable character, VATS them repeatedly, satisfy the perk each time, and farm a literally infinite amount of action points off someone who refuses to stay down. The cosmic horror of this scenario is not addressed by any in-game dialogue, and the weirdest part is that none of this was actually designed by Bethesda or Obsidian. The whole thing was submitted by a guy named Marc-André Deslongchamps to the Fallout 10th Anniversary Perk Contest back in 2007, and he won. Bethesda then implemented his fan submission directly into the game and have brought it back in every mainline release since, calling the design elegant and simple. Lawbringer. This is what happens when you take Contract Killer and ask the developers if there's a more wholesome version available. Lawbringer is the good karma equivalent of the same body parts business, except the parts are fingers instead of ears, and the buyer is a woman named Sonora Cruz instead of a guy in a scrapyard. Sonora runs the Regulators, a vigilante outfit that pays Wastelanders 5 caps per finger of an evil character they've handled. If your karma is above 750 when you turn the fingers in, the rate jumps to 10 caps apiece, because Virtue apparently gets a loyalty discount. Each finger also awards you 10 karma, which means you can essentially convert minor sentient threats directly into a higher moral standing. Taking the perk also disables the scripted Regulator squads that would normally come after you if your karma drops into the negatives, because Sonora's outfit decides not to send a team after their own contractor. There's a bug where the patients in the Megaton and Rivet City clinics who are sleeping in beds will spawn fingers in their inventory, even though they are not, by any reasonable definition, evil, which means a Lawbringer player can roll into a clinic, handle a few unconscious patients, lose karma for what they just did, and then immediately make that karma back the moment they hand the fingers to Sonora. The game has no internal mechanism for noticing that the system is bleeding moral logic out of every seam. There's also a man named Junders Plunkett, who only spawns into the world once you've taken this perk, and his finger alone is worth 1,000 caps plus a unique pair of spiked knuckles. So somewhere in the Capital Wasteland, there's a guy who exists exclusively because you opted into the moral finger trade, and his entire purpose for existing is to be turned into pocket change and a melee weapon. And the absolute peak is that nothing stops you from having Lawbringer and Contract Killer active simultaneously. You become a fully diversified contractor in the Wasteland's body parts marketplace, collecting ears off the morally upright and fingers off the morally bankrupt, turning everyone you encounter into a SKU. And those were Fallout's most disturbing perks, because surviving the apocalypse isn't just about fighting monsters. Sometimes it's about becoming one. Which perk disturbed you the most? Let me know in the comments and see you on the next one.